Good morning, good afternoon, or good night. This is Mr. Hales coming at you with the Civil War and Reconstruction Test podcast. So make sure that you have a pen and paper or have something, to type on near you, and take good notes while you listen to this podcast. You can pause, you can forward, you can rewind. So whatever you do, just make sure that you take notes. Don't just rely on memorizing what I say. Take the notes and then memorize those notes for the test. And you will be right as rain. Okay. First open-ended response question that we will be discussing is, how did the Missouri Compromise affect slavery in the territories? How did the Missouri Compromise affect slavery in the territories? So this is 3-part question. Each part is worth 4 points, so this is a total of 12 points. The Missouri Compromise applied to the Louisiana Purchase, so you have to make the connection to the Missouri Compromise and the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson made the purchase 1803. So the Missouri Compromise, it applies to the Louisiana Purchase. Slavery was allowed in lands south of Missouri's southern border, and land north of the border were considered free. So slavery was allowed in lands south of Missouri's southern border. The only exception, ladies and gentlemen, was Missouri itself, and lands north of the border were free. So that's how the Missouri Compromise affected slavery in the territories. Next question. What different views did John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, the great compromiser, express during the conflict over the extension of slavery in 1850? So what different views did John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay express during the conflict over the extension of slavery in 1850? Well, first, Calhoun insisted that slavery be allowed in the territories. So not all of our territories were states yet. All right, so not all of the land, United States land, were states yet. It was made up of a lot of territories at the time. So Calhoun felt that if slavery were not permitted in these territories, the North would control Congress as new free states joined the Union. And keep in mind, every state gets 2 senators. So if slavery was not permitted in the eyes of Calhoun, any of those new states joining in would have 2 senators that would normally vote with the North on most issues, especially slavery. And Calhoun supported secession over the issue. Now, Clay, on the other hand, Henry Clay, great compromiser, believed the most important thing was to keep the Union together. So Clay believed it was important to keep the Union together. He supported a compromise that would give each party something it wanted. So one of the compromises, of course, was Missouri comes in as a slave state. Maine comes into the Union as a free state. So that was sort of the compromise that they came up with, among many other things. Number 3. Why were many people in the North angry over the Fugitive Slave Act? Why were many people in the North angry over the Fugitive Slave Act? Well, the act forced everyone to capture refugees from slavery, even if they opposed slavery. It made Northerners feel as if they were forced to support slavery. So, if they see a runaway fugitive slave, it was now law that a Northerner would have to help with the catching of this refugee slave. And this made Northerners feel as if they were being forced to support this. All right? So the act forced everyone to capture refugees from slavery, even if they opposed slavery, and it made Northerners feel as if they were forced to support slavery. So that is why many people in the North were angry over the Fugitive Slave Act. Number 4, why did Stephen Douglas propose the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and how did the act lead to violence? So now Stephen Douglas believed in popular sovereignty, right? So remember to connect Stephen Douglas to popular sovereignty. So Douglas wanted to maintain the balance between the number of slave and free states by using just that, popular sovereignty, a vote. The act led to violence when pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri voted illegally in Kansas. So border ruffians, pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri crossed the state lines and voted illegally in Kansas. And this helped to elect a pro-slavery legislature. Now, on the other hand, anti-slavery forces elected their own legislature because they knew that there was a lot of voter fraud going on during this election. So that meant there were now two governments, and this meant violence and chaos for Kansas. Can't have two governments. But they did have two governments, and it meant violence and chaos for Kansas. So one more time. Why did Stephen Douglas propose the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and how did the act lead to violence? Douglas wanted to maintain the balance between the number of slave and free states by using popular sovereignty. The act led to violence when pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri voted illegally in Kansas, helping to elect a pro-slavery legislature. Anti-slavery forces elected their own legislature. And then two governments meant violence and chaos for Kansas. So now we are in the middle of our podcast, and that means I am going to give you a couple extra credit questions for those who are listening to the podcast. Now, you have to score at least a 70%. So you have to score at least a 70% on the open-ended response section for these extra credit points to kick in. So you can't just go to a friend, ask for the answers, and then bomb this section of the test. No, you have to get at least a 70%, which, by the way, isn't much, ladies and gentlemen. It's not that hard to score. I think it's 17 or 17 and a half points on this section in order for the extra credit to kick in. So the first extra credit question. As a spectator on TV or in person, what are my three most memorable sports victories that I've ever witnessed? Well, as a 15-year-old, the 1996 World Series was definitely a highlight up to that point when the Yankees beat the Braves in the World Series. I'm a big Yankee fan. I had never seen a World Series victory yet. The Yankees, as I was growing up, the Yankees were barely in the playoffs. 1994, when we had our best team, there was a strike. And in 1995, we lost to Seattle in the first round. Then finally in 1996, World Series, the Yankees beat the Braves for the first World Series I was able to witness that the Yankees won. So that's the first memorable sporting event. Next, the 2000 Stanley Cup. So the 2000 Stanley Cup victory for the Devils. The Devils beat the Dallas Stars. So that was very exciting. I loved that Patrick Elias, Jason Arnott, Peter Sikora line, that A line. It's one of the best lines in NHL history, in my opinion. Of course, being a Devils fan, but that 2000 Stanley Cup playoffs when the Devils beat the Stars, that's definitely up there. And then I, of course, like all the Yankee ticker tape parades, I went to the Devils parade in the at the time it was the Meadowlands, the Continental Airlines Arena, and they had a parade in the parking lot. So whether you count that as a parade or not, I don't know, but it was a nice parade, nice moment. So the 2000 Stanley Cup playoffs when the Devils beat the Dallas Stars, that's definitely in my top three. And finally, probably the most surprising of the sporting events, I will never forget. My buddies were all over my house. My wife and I hosted a Super Bowl party. It was the 2008 Super Bowl, 2007 season, 2008 Super Bowl when the Giants beat the 19-0 New England Patriots, Tom Brady's Patriots. It really could not get any better than that. That Super Bowl is considered by many to be one of, if not the greatest Super Bowl. It was a lot of fun watching the Patriots very upset, but it was even more fun because it was my team that did it. So that 2008 Super Bowl where the Giants beat the Patriots, that's got to be my favorite moment in sports history. Now back to the important stuff, the questions and answers for your test. How did white Southerners, African Americans, and white Northerners react to the Dred Scott decision? So how did white Southerners, African Americans, and white Northerners react to the Dred Scott decision? First, white Southerners, they cheered it. All right, it meant Dred Scott went back into slavery because Congress cannot vote on whether there should be or they cannot outlaw slavery, I should say. They can vote on whatever they want, but they cannot outlaw slavery in the territories. That's what our Supreme Court said. So white Southerners, they cheered it. African Americans, on the other hand, were angry and they condemned it, obviously. And white Northerners, they were shocked and dismayed by the decision because they started to turn on slavery. Remember Uncle Tom's Cabin? They started to turn on slavery, believing that it was immoral and it was evil. It was an evil. So white Southerners cheered it. African Americans were angry and condemned it. White Northerners were shocked and dismayed by the decision. Open-ended question number 6. How did Abraham Lincoln emerge as a Republican leader? How did Abraham Lincoln emerge as a Republican leader? So in 1858, Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas, that same Stephen Douglas, popular sovereignty, to a series of debates in the campaign for Senate. Now, Douglas was the incumbent, so he was already the senator. Lincoln was trying to unseat him. The debates showed that Lincoln was strongly opposed to any expansion of slavery. Not that he wanted to take slavery away from the states that already had it, but he did not want it expanded upon. And that means he did not want slavery in the territories and soon to be new states. So in 1858, Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of debates in the campaign for the Senate. These debates showed that Lincoln was strongly opposed to any expansion of slavery. Now, Lincoln did lose that election. Douglas was reelected to the Senate. But they will debate again, and this time on the national stage when Lincoln defeats Douglas for the presidency. All right, so that's how Abraham Lincoln emerged as a Republican leader. And our last 2. Why was President Lincoln cautious about making the abolition of slavery a goal of the war? So the abolition of slavery a goal for the war. Why was he cautious about that? So Lincoln believed that slavery was wrong. So he did believe that slavery was wrong. He believed it was an evil, immoral. But he did not want to turn the slaveholding border states against the Union. So there were still 4 slaveholding border states that were fighting for the Union. And he did not want them to then turn around and then decide to fight for the Confederacy. So that was one reason in which he did not want the abolition of slavery to be a goal of the war. Also, he was not sure enough people in the Union would fight against slavery. Remember in class we talked about the issues, all right? Why people fight. If they believe in a cause to fight, they're going to do a much better job if they have something that they are really fighting for. Lincoln, at the time, at the start of the war, mind you, it was 1861. He's going to change his mind a couple of years later. But at the start of the war, he was not sure enough people in the Union would fight against slavery. So Lincoln believed that slavery was wrong, but he did not want to turn the slaveholding border states against the Union. Also, he was not sure enough people in the Union would fight against slavery. So that is why President Lincoln was cautious about making the abolition of slavery a goal of the war. And last but not least, how did the Emancipation Proclamation affect the status of enslaved African Americans? How did the Emancipation Proclamation affect the status of enslaved African Americans? So, at the time, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, no slaves were freed. So, no slaves were free. The proclamation affected only slaves in the Confederate States, not under Union control. So, he was only freeing the slaves that were in the Confederate States. Remember, 1863. It's very close to the election of 1864. So we did not want to lose Northern votes. Lincoln, although great president, he was still a politician and made political decisions that may not have been on his side of moral issues. All right. So enslaved African Americans in Union border states and in Union-held Confederate territories were not covered by the Emancipation Proclamation. So how did the Emancipation Proclamation affect the status of enslaved African Americans? At the time, no slaves were freed. The proclamation affected only slaves in the Confederate States not under Union control, and enslaved African Americans in Union border states and in Union-held Confederate territories were not covered. So those are the 8 open-ended response questions on the test. Remember, from our info text, all of the questions from the info text, they are on the test. So there are questions about the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln waiting until there was a Union victory. There was also, let's see here, as I look at the actual test, there's questions about Uncle Tom's Cabin, a more thorough question about the Compromise of 1850. You're looking at 2 Supreme Court cases. You need to know Dred Scott versus Sanford. You need to know Plessy versus Ferguson. You need to know about the John Brown raid and why the Civil War marked a turning point in American history. There are going to be 10 people on this test, 6 of which you learned about during the presentations about the battles and their generals. So you're going to have Jefferson Davis, who was the Confederate president. You're going to have Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Ulysses Grant, Robert Lee, George Meade, and William T. Sherman. You're also going to need to know Henry Clay, the great compromiser, Stephen Douglas, once again, John Brown, and Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator. You're going to need to know the 3 amendments as well that we learned: the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. All notes that you have. So make sure you study up, do a good job on this test. Tests are 30% of your grade, so make sure you nail this one. All right. Good luck.